Hi, welcome to the Apologist Bookshelf. Gary Zacharias here, and I really appreciate you joining me. I'm going to look again, I've done a couple of previous podcasts, at a book called The Complete Bible Answer Book by Hank Hanegraaff, the Bible Answer Man. This has got so many great questions in here that people ask, over 150 questions that people ask in areas like religion and cults and discernment and aberrant teachings, spiritual warfare, Christianity and science, and on and on and on. I'm just going to take a portion here. I'm starting on the section that deals with God, and then let's see, historical Jesus and Christology or Christology, and then I want to move to religions and cults. So this one you hear quite a bit is when we talk about Jesus, and some of the people who don't believe he's God will take you to Colossians 1:15, and they'll say, well, look right there. It says Jesus Christ is the firstborn over all creation. So he's not God. God created him, and then Jesus created the rest of the universe. So the question is, well, how could the eternal Son of God be the firstborn over all creation? So how can he be the eternal creator of all things and yet firstborn himself? He can't create himself. Well, pretty simple answer. Hanegraaff points out that Paul is actually referring to the term preeminence, and that's in the Old Testament. For example, in Jeremiah 31, Ephraim is called the Lord's firstborn, but Manasseh was born before that. And then we meet David in Psalm 89:27. He's appointed the Lord's firstborn, but he was the youngest of Jesse's son. So both Ephraim and David were not physically born first in the family, but both were firstborn in the sense of preeminence or prime position. So Paul also mentions Jesus as the firstborn over all creation, not the firstborn in creation. So that word over is hugely important. And he points out in Colossians, just a couple verses later, Colossians 1:17, Paul says, talking about Jesus, he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And so Hanegraaff points out the Jehovah's Witnesses who say the Son is not pre-existent, he's not co-eternal. They have to change the wording in their Bible. They insert the word other. So they'll say, he is before all other things. And that's that flawed New World Translation. We've talked about that before. It's not a good translation. And so we see Jesus is the eternal Son of God. Okay, so let's move ahead here. And he talks about religions and cults. Here's a huge question. It's so important. What distinguishes Christianity from other religions? He says several reasons. One, Hanegraaff says, unlike other religions, you've got Christianity rooted in history with real evidence. I mean, think about what the Bible says, that he was born in Bethlehem. That's in Judea. During the reign of a particular Caesar, he was put to death by a first-century Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. So we get eyewitness testimony and even extra-biblical evidence as well. Now, of course, Hanegraaff doesn't have the time. These are short chapters, just a page and a half each, roughly. So he doesn't get into that, but that's a very good point. There are extra-biblical evidences for the truth of Christianity. It says, furthermore, here's another reason Christianity is unique. All of the other influential religious leaders, I mean, think about Muhammad and Baha'u'llah, Lao Tzu, Krishna, only Jesus claimed to be God in human flesh. Now, this wasn't just an empty boast. He vindicated his claim to deity because of the resurrection. Other religions do claim miracles, but those miracles lack historical validation. Finally, Hanegraaff says, how is Christianity unique? It's a coherent belief structure. Says, now some Christian doctrines are going to go beyond what we can understand, but they're not irrational or contradictory. Says Christianity accounts for things like the human mind, laws of science, the laws of logic, ethical norms, justice, love, meaning in life, the problem of evil and suffering, that's a big one, and truth. So his point is Christianity corresponds with the reality of our present condition. Exactly right. So what distinguishes Christianity from other religions? Three things: rooted in history and science, has a leader that claimed to be God, and it's a coherent belief structure. Very, very well done in just a page and a half. Here's another question that people ask. Well, don't all religions lead to God? I mean, we've heard that over and over again. says, of course, be careful. He starts off, he says, anybody says, no, all religions do not lead to God. What happens? You're called narrow-minded, and you're called intolerant. But Hanegraaff says, my answer is no, not all religions lead to God. It's incorrect and illogical to maintain this. So he said, well, just take a look. Look at world religions. Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism. So what do you see? They contradict each other. Moses says there's one God. Krishna says there are a lot of gods. Buddha was agnostic. They can't all be right. They might all be wrong, but they can't all be right. He says another reason to think that not all religions lead to God, he said the road of religion leads steeply uphill, but the road of Christianity goes downhill. Why? He says religion is fallen humanity's attempt to reach up and become acceptable to God. How? By things that we do. Lots of activities. I mean, think about the Muslims. They've got their 5 pillars of faith. Think about Buddhism. It's got the Eightfold Path. Think about Mormonism, all the things you've got to do. But Christianity is a divine gift on what's already been done for us through Christ. Very different. And finally, don't all religions lead to God? Well, what did Jesus say? He said there's one way. I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Now, Jesus validated that through his resurrection, didn't he? He didn't just say it. He lived it, died, and came back again. So it says the opinions of other religious leaders are worthless. They died and they're still dead. Only Jesus was able to lay his life down and take it up again. His opinion's way more valid than the others. So don't all religions lead to God? No. In fact, this is just me talking, but I think about that story of the blind men and the elephant, that we all have a picture of part of the truth. That doesn't work because, I've done a talk on that, but first of all, who's the person that has sight and can tell the blind people what they're doing is incorrect? It's a pretty arrogant view. Anyway, let's move on. What happens to a person who's never heard of Jesus? Here's another key question. He said he gets that all the time in his broadcast when he deals with questions people have. Will God condemn people to hell for not believing in someone they've never heard of? So somebody somewhere in Africa or Asia or wherever it happens to be, they haven't heard of Jesus, and so God's going to send them to hell? Well, here's a key thought that I'm so glad Hanegraaff mentions this. People aren't condemned to hell for not believing in Jesus. Why are they condemned to hell? Sin. So the question is not how can God send one to hell, but how could God condescend to save any one of us? They said, furthermore, Hanegraaff says, if ignorance was a ticket to heaven, then said, don't do a Billy Graham crusade or something like that. Have a cover-up campaign. Don't have evangelism. We got to get rid of Bibles. We should close all the churches. Then that way nobody will hear of Christ and everybody will be going to heaven. Well, that doesn't make any sense. And he says, finally, he said we should emphasize that everybody has the light of both creation and conscience. And if we respond to the light we have, God will give us more light. And he has this quote from Paul toward the end of his chapter here. This is Paul in Acts 17 when he's giving his famous Areopagus speech. From one man he made every nation of men, speaking of God, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and he determined the time set for them and the exact places where they should live. Now, why did God do this? Paul says God did this so that men would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. I think that's a really good point there. So, what happens to a person who's never heard of Jesus? God is fair. We know he's fair. If we get whatever light, we have an internal compass that tells us what's right, what's wrong. God will give us more light. I mean, think about we're hearing more and more of Muslims who are seeing God and Jesus in visions and dreams and all. It's pretty amazing. Let's do a couple more. How were people who lived before the time of Christ saved? And he says, some will say, well, they were saved because they kept the law. And Hanegraaff says, no, the Bible says otherwise. It says over and over, the Bible, from the beginning to the end, says you're saved by grace alone, through faith alone, on account of Christ alone. And the Apostle Paul quotes the Old Testament to drive home the reality that nobody can be declared righteous by observing the law. Look at Romans 3:20. And then Paul points to Abraham. He was the father of the Jews. He said, well, look at Abraham. His salvation came to him through faith apart from any works. And this is what Paul's saying in Romans and Genesis and Galatians, when he's referencing Genesis. If, in fact, Abraham was justified by works, he had something to boast about, but not before God. What does the Scripture say? Abraham believed God and was credited to him as righteousness. And he says, back to Hanegraaff, he says, Jesus is the substance that fulfills those types and shadows in the Old Testament. Look at Luke 24:44, Romans 3:21 through 22, Hebrews 1:1 through 3. Each year the Jews celebrated the Passover to keep them focused on the one who's going to come and die for their sins. And we go to Hebrews, and it says the law is only a shadow of the good things that are coming, not the realities. So Jesus stands at the apex of history. So people who lived before the time of Christ look forward to his sacrifice for them. It was faith. It was faith. It was not their works that saved them. Let's do maybe a couple more. He's still talking about religions here. So here's another question he says pops up often. What do we mean by cult? He said, what is a cult? Well, it's got various connotations. You could define it sociologically. So it's a religious or a semi-religious small group. The followers are controlled by strong leadership. That's huge. And they usually have a huge loyalty for this leader. And they're galvanized through intimidation. And says this kind of cultist is sort of like a we versus they siege mentality. They've been cut off often from even their immediate families. He says we can also call a cult, we can define it theologically. It's a pseudo-Christian organization. It claims to be Christian, but it either compromises or confuses or contradicts essential Christian doctrine. They'll operate under the guise of Christianity. They'll say they're Christians, but they deviate from the orthodox teaching of the Christian faith that we've seen in ancient creeds. They get really good at taking texts out of context. I think that's a good point. He says, finally, Hanegraaff says, the media-driven culture has used that term cult as a negative thing. That it's people that are surrounding a religious belief structure. And it says even Christianity then, by that idea, could be referred to as a cult of Old Testament Judaism. So he said, we've got to be very careful when we talk about cults. It's hard to be diligent to define the terms. I would suggest we probably shouldn't even use that term cult these days. The minute you do that, everybody's shield defenses come up. And we're not going to get through if we say, oh, you're a cult. We just need to show the differences. They're not Christian. They're something else besides Christian. And that leads, of course, to one more. We'll do one more here. Number 83 in his book, Are Jehovah's Witnesses Christian? Now they say, like the Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses say that Christianity died when the last of the apostles died, and it did not get resurrected until their founder, Charles Taze Russell, organized the Watchtower Society in the 1870s. They say the cross is a pagan symbol that got adopted by a fallen church, and salvation is impossible if you're not part of the Watchtower organization. Now, these people that come to our doorstep as Jehovah's Witnesses, they see themselves as the only authentic expression of Christianity. But they said their society compromises, confuses, or contradicts essential Christian doctrine. Well, let's start in. What do they compromise? Well, first, they compromise the nature of God. They teach the idea that the Trinity is just freakish. It's a three-headed God that was invented by Satan. And Jesus is just a God, small g. In fact, they see Jesus as created by God as the Archangel Michael, and then he came to this earth. He's merely human. And after his crucifixion, he was recreated an immaterial spirit creature. They deny the physical resurrection of Jesus. So according to Russell, the body that hung on, they call it a torture stake, either dissolved into gases or is preserved somewhere as the grand memorial of God's love. Wow, they have really compromised things there, haven't they? Now, Christians say all believers are going to spend eternity with Christ in a new heaven and new earth. We see that in Revelation 21 and 22. But the Watchtower says only 144,000 are going to make it to heaven. The rest of them will live on earth. And that's why if you ever notice their booklets that they hand out, it's always a beautiful picture of this earth. And that's their goal, because 144,000 are already taken care of. So there's a great crowd of others, they say, that will live on this earth. The heavenly class are born again. They get the baptism of the Holy Spirit, and they partake of communion, but the earthly class doesn't get any of these things. And they even point out that heaven's door was closed irrevocably in 1935. And they point to flashes of prophetic light by some of their leaders. Of course, the catch is they've had predictions of end times that have gone wrong over and over. They said the world would end in 1914, 1918, 1925, 1975. So they've gotten so many things wrong. Now, here's another area that they're different from us. They get a threat of being disfellowshipped, which means basically kicked out. They're barred from celebrating Christmas, birthdays, holidays. They have regulations regarding vaccinations, organ transplants, blood transfusions, and they keep changing them. So, for example, in 1931, they were told to refuse vaccinations. In 1952, they got rid of that regulation. In 1967, organ transplants were what they called cannibalism. But in 1980, they got rid of that. In 1909, they were against blood transfusions. They said, no doubt this too will someday become a relic of the past. And it says, what's the problem here? Tens of thousands of their believers have paid the ultimate physical price as well. Yeah, my wife knew somebody who passed away when he could have been saved because he was a Jehovah's Witness. So I said, Watchtower adherents do more for a lie than Christians do for the truth. It's really sad. But he said these and a host of other doctrinal perversions keep them from rightly being considered Christian. And I have done several podcasts involving Jehovah's Witnesses. If you're curious about that, some more information. There's a really good book by Ron Rhodes, Rhodes, called Reasoning from the Scriptures with the Jehovah's Witnesses. That's excellent. So I will stop at that point, but those are some really good questions, and I think Hanegraaff, in just a short period of time, does a nice job. So if you just want kind of quick answers to a lot of things, consider the Bible Answer Book. This one's called the Complete Bible Answer Book. I think it originally came out in 2 volumes, and this is a collection of the 2 volumes. So thanks so much for being part of this podcast, and we'll do another one soon. Thanks again.